ride his bicycle.
Everybody, welcome. Welcome to the National Youth Summit on Abolition, presented by the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, in collaboration with PBS's American Experience and the Smithsonian affiliations, with the support of the Verizon Foundation. My name is Alison Stewart. We're here in Washington, D.C. Those on the web, welcome. You can probably hear there's some other people in the room, a whole bunch of high school students. Let them know you're here. I want to do a little bit of business to do. We have a lot of people to thank for today's program. First of all, we want to thank the U.S. Department of State Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. We want to thank the Polaris Project for World Without Slavery and the Slavery Footprint for their assistance in developing this program. You probably all had this conversation kit. You probably read it the first time. It's going to seem like a whole different kit after today's conversation, because you're going to learn so much from the great people we have on stage. Now, 2013 marks the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. We all here in D.C. know that D.C. signed a little bit earlier, right? Emancipation Day, 16th, 1862. You're 1 year ahead. Give yourself a hand, D.C. But we're going to be looking at today, exploring in this Youth Summit, some of the issues around slavery, about the history of slavery as well as modern-day slavery, how abolitionists work to end 19th century slavery, how today's activists are using some of the tactics from the 19th century to fight against human trafficking, and what we can do as individuals today, what y'all can do as individuals to help people in need. We're also, this is the fun part, we get to watch some video clips from an amazing documentary. I don't know if any of you guys saw it. It's from PBS American Experience. It is called The Abolitionists. It tells the story of 5 19th century abolitionists. It is really stunning when you see the work they did and in the conditions they did it. Today also, as I said, we have people joining us from around the world. Megan Smith down front is, wave Megan, let everybody see you. She is going to be monitoring our online chat, so people who are watching us on the web, you can have a voice in this conversation too. You can email Megan, she'll shoot it up to me on the tablet, and we'll get your questions involved as well. All right, to folks watching around the United States, let's say hi to the folks at our Smithsonian affiliation partner at the Underground Railroad Freedom Center, in Cincinnati, Ohio. They are watching. The Heinz History Center in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, another Smithsonian affiliate. Also at President Lincoln's Cottage, the site where he developed the Emancipation Proclamation, and the U.S. Department of State's Embassy Youth Course Program. They are joining us from Malta, Zambia, and Laos. So let's welcome all of them. Now, let's get to this panel, this great panel. First of all, to my left is Ken Morris. Ken is the founder and president of the Frederick Douglas Family Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ending modern-day slavery. He is also, let me get all the greats right, the great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. To his left is Lois Brown, the class of 1958 distinguished professor at Wesleyan University, and she was an advisor on the American Experience documentary, The Abolitionists. To her left is 17-year-old Anna Alarcon. She's a senior at the Metropolitan Learning Center in Hartford, Connecticut, and president of the Students Against Stopping Slavery. And Ambassador Luis CdeBaca is the head of the United States Department of State Office of Monitoring and Combating Trafficking in Persons. Ambassador, let's get our definition straight. What is the modern-day definition of slavery?
Well, we use these euphemisms in diplomacy so we can talk about unpalatable things. And so this notion of human trafficking is broadly defined by the United States as all of the activities in recruiting somebody into, moving them into, or holding them in a condition of compelled service. What you're talking about is folks who can't leave service, whether it's because of a debt or whether it's because of threats of violence. Slavery is not legal anywhere in the world anymore. But the last country to abolish it was only 7 years ago in Mauritania. Wow. So this is a new thing in a lot of parts of the world, where we're coming out and we're saying you can't hold somebody else as a slave. But sadly, there's about 27 million people still around the world who are suffering this. And there's been cases, we're about 3 blocks from the White House today. There's been cases within 5 miles of where we're sitting of both foreign kids here in the United States and Americans who've been held in slavery.
How is it, what are the cracks in the modern day criminal system, or the justice system, I should say, that allows this to exist?
Well, I think that sometimes it comes down to there's a zone of impunity where in immigrant communities, in marginalized minority communities, and others, that the police don't really protect folks in those communities. And we see that all over the world and here in the United States. So part of it is making sure that the police realize that a crime that happens to someone, no matter who they are and where they're from, that that's an important thing and needs to be stopped. You know, for the last 150 years, too often when you'd have what used to be called peonage, debt bondage, sharecropping, whatever we'd call it, the local sheriffs would let that happen because it was happening to black folks, and they didn't care if the crime was happening against them. In a lot of ways, those jobs in the fields of America have been replaced now with Latino immigrants. The same fields, maybe even the same farmers, picking the same crops, but now it's Hispanics. Well, the same thing, the local police maybe never go out to protect those people. So part of it is just standing up and saying government needs to protect everybody.
This is a little bit of a controversial question, but do some of these people you're talking about, do they see themselves as slaves? Do they see themselves in that way?
I think a lot of people see themselves as working hard to try to make a better life for their family. They know it's wrong that the boss is threatening them. They know it's wrong that the boss is going to hunt somebody down if they try to leave without paying back the debt. They know it's wrong that they might be getting sexually abused. But if you just ask them straight out, are you a slave? They probably won't say yes. They'll say, I'm being terribly mistreated and I can't leave. So I think that part of it is that notion of kind of how do we define slavery in a world where it's been illegal for so long?
Professor, let's bring you in terms of the historical definition of slavery. When you talk to your students, how do you talk to them about it?
Well, one of the things that is so important to realize about slavery is that it's all about possession. It's all about worth. And if you are talking about slavery, you're talking about economics, you're talking about money. And one of the great points, I think, that really should stop us in our tracks is that during the 19th century, the only thing in America worth more than the land itself in this nation were people who were enslaved, and that they represented this incredible capital. They were essential to the foundations of the American economy. They were essential to the export of goods abroad. Industry depended upon them, and that's where we begin to define slavery. So chattel slavery, as it was called in the 19th century, the very word chattel is defined as possession, right? And so in that sense, somebody who can't get away may not imagine themselves as being possessed by another, but that's a hallmark of the 19th century and 18th century definitions of slavery. And then slavery itself, what does it mean to enslave someone? It means to reduce them to a particularly confining and very one-dimensional state of being. It is an insistence that they have no humanity, that they have no spirit worth recognizing, and that and it's a curious balance, because at the same time that they have value, that they represent capital, that they can be purchased and sold to recover debts. At the same time, there's an argument that they are worth nothing, right? That they can just be set aside. So we have a real tension when we come to define slavery, because it depends on human bodies and it depends on an idea that they are not human. So that's part of the tension.
That's interesting when you talk about describing something and someone as having nothingness. Can you talk a little bit why that is so important and why that was so important to keeping the slave trade alive, the sense that these people aren't people, right. They don't have souls, they're nothing.
Right. It's when we imagine the 19th century, and as we begin to get into the stories of those who emerged from the Middle Passage, which was literally the middle piece of the voyage from African homelands to the New World and America, so much of what comes across are the absolutely just the terrifying, horrifying nature of the trade. The really awful, wrenching moments of the slave auctions. And it's impossible to imagine that you could do that kind of work, rounding people up, managing, organizing sales, negotiating. And you're not doing that in silence. You're doing that as people are crying out for loved ones. You're doing that as individuals are trying to preserve ties that are tenuous. But in order to do that work, you have to cease to see them as people. You have to redefine altogether, because you have to literally shut your heart down, because you begin to intellectualize it. I'm just doing a job here. I don't hear anything. I don't really listen. No, I'm not going to understand that you have just lost your child. No, that doesn't factor into me. I've got numbers. I've got particular kinds of quotas to meet. So the way I think it really comes down to, it's a strategy to perpetuate slavery. And what we find in the studies of the 19th century in particular, is that the moment you introduce people to scenes, to individuals, to the reality, once they saw it, they could no longer walk away. So it wasn't about law, it was about the laws of the heart, not the laws of the head or the marketplace.
And I want to let the audience know there are microphones all throughout the auditorium, so even if you're whispering, it's getting picked up on the webcast. We're going to ask you guys to keep it down, okay? One of the things that's interesting, Ambassador, is the professor was speaking about how this was all done just out in the open. And what you've been describing is something that's behind closed doors. Is that the biggest difference?
I think so. I think, one of the things that the framers of the 13th Amendment recognized was that if you make it so that slavery is illegal, that there will still be people who try to keep doing it. So that's why the 13th Amendment says both slavery and involuntary servitude shall never exist. And it's that notion of someone who is doing this on their own without the government approving of it anymore. But the reality is sometimes it's out in the open, and sometimes we don't even see it in front of our face. We had, when I was at the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, I did investigations into women who were being held captive in strip clubs and made to dance in the strip clubs. And, they came to the United States thinking they were going to be on a student exchange program for the State Department. And instead, they end up in Detroit dancing. Well, the police were going to that strip club. They just thought that these were beautiful Russian women who were working in that club because the girls were scared enough they weren't going to tell anybody. So it was right there out in the open, but the guys who were going in there weren't seeing it. When we drive by a field in the southeast and we see a bunch of migrant workers, it's easier not to ask the question. So it's hidden, but it's kind of hiding in plain sight in a really counterintuitive way, because it's easier for us to come up with a way not to see it, because that notion of confronting them and confronting their reality, seeing their humanity. But I think that the founders and the folks who put together abolition for us gave us the tools to actually undo it today, because they recognized that this would happen, that this kind of underground slavery would happen in the absence of legal slavery.
Well, Professor, we mentioned that you were a consultant on this documentary, The Abolitionists, and we'd love for you to set up a clip.
Okay, all right. What we're about to see really underscores the power of testimony, the power of your voice. And we will see Frederick Douglass. Walking and talking with William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison is the editor of the nation's most influential newspaper, The Liberator. It's based in Boston. And Mr. Douglass has come to Nantucket to hear Mr. Garrison speak. And at that meeting, Frederick Douglass makes his debut as an orator in the abolitionist movement. And we're about to see how these two men who come to this situation very differently begin to form a partnership and begin the work of abolition together.
Okay, let's see it.
Mr. Douglass. I have never seen an audience so captivated. I myself was carried away, as you saw.
I was so nervous I could barely stand.
You were wonderful. if you don't mind my asking, how did you first realize that you were a slave?
Slowly. I was raised by my grandmother. We lived far from the slave quarters, and so I didn't know what went on there. And one day when I was 6 years old, my grandmother was told to walk me to the workhouse near the master's place. She sent me over to play with the other children and abandoned me there.
Dear Lord.
She loved me, but she had no choice.
What a horrible crime. An innocent child. Why were you raised by your grandmother? What about your mother?
My mother, I only saw her a few times at night. She was taken away after I was born to work as a field hand 12 miles away. She walked all the way back a handful of times, but even so, they never let me know her enough to really love her. That left a hole I can't express it.
My mother left me too. I was 5. She worked in another town for a few years. I missed her terribly. But that was nothing compared with...
No, it's never nothing.
My dear Mr. Douglas, join me. I urge you. You have a gift. Sir, you really do.
You flatter me.
No. No, I don't.
Mr. Garrison, you must understand how unexpected this is. I never imagined...
You have an opportunity to strike a blow for the slaves who continue to suffer as we speak. Did the Lord give you these gifts so that you could spend your life working in the shipyards?
I see now why you are such an effective advocate.
You do it then.
I think I will.
Ken, I know you're going to tell us a little bit about your family, but I have to ask you, what does it feel like to watch that?
You know, it's very hard to watch it because in that scene, in that clip, he's talking about not having a family. And then his mother worked on a plantation that was 12 miles away, and in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields, picking cotton from sun up to sundown, and then walk 12 miles in the middle of the night just to spend a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep, and then walk 12 miles back to the plantation so that she could be back there working by the time the sun came up, because she would most likely endure a brutal whipping. Mm-hmm. So that clip right there is very emotional to know that my great-great-great-grandfather grew up without a family.
So I'm going to ask the audience once again to just remember there's microphones all around your room, so your small conversations are getting picked up. But I'd love you to give your full attention to Ken. He's going to tell you a little bit more about his family.
Well, as I was introduced, I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to these American heroes, not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to both of these men. But I bet everybody in here knows or knew a grandparent, and many of you may have known a great-grandparent. Well, that's how close I feel to both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, because my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she met Frederick Douglass as a little girl, and she lived to be 103 years old. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she called him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when I stopped to think that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. In a sense, I can say I stand just one person away from history. And we're not that far removed from this history.
In terms of your family history, we were talking a little bit backstage, that your family, it's so public. Everyone knows so much about Frederick Douglass and so much about Booker T. Washington. Would you be comfortable sharing one family story with us?
Well, there's a story that I've always liked because I've always been fascinated by his hair. And he used to give horseback rides. He had 21 grandchildren.
21?
21. And his grandkids would get on his back and he would get down on all fours and he would give them horseback rides. And you know what they would use as the reins?
His hair.
His hair, yeah. That's one of my favorite stories.
One of the most moving parts of the Abolitionists is the moment that Frederick Douglass has that emotional moment when he says, I'm no longer going to be a slave. Can you tell our audience a little bit about that?
Well, he said that he didn't know he was a slave until he found out he couldn't do the things that he wanted to do. He was born into the most horrific conditions that a human being can be subjected to, but yet, through the power of education, now he never spent one day of his life in a classroom because it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write, so he was a self-taught scholar. And he would go on to escape from slavery at the age of 20 and at this point come into contact with Lloyd Garrison. And the importance of Frederick Douglass was that he told his story because he had experienced it and lived it. And he was able to communicate it in a way that nobody else, no fugitive slave before him had ever done. So this really pushed the abolitionist movement forward because Frederick Douglass was now out there telling his story and talking about the inhumanity of slavery that he had endured.
And we're going to go to a video question in a minute. I just want to bring Professor in. We talked about, you said it very offhand, it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. You could have your finger cut off if you were caught learning to read and write. Just fill our audience a little bit about how extraordinary it was to be able to be educated or learn to even read as a slave, and how dangerous that could be too.
Well, there are two things, I think, to really underscore here, and that is that as slavery is spreading across the United States, you also have free communities of free people of color who are valuing education, who are doing their best to overcome the segregation and the disenfranchisement and the lack of funding for schools for children of color. And in those communities, as people emancipate themselves from slavery and come north, one of the first things that you begin to see happening are schools for older ladies, schools for gentlemen, schools for children, night schools, exhibitions. But time and time again, you realize that the prohibition on learning, right, on organized and public education for people of African descent and those who were enslaved had everything to do with the fact that if you learned your lessons, if you learned and were able to read and write, you could write yourself out of slavery, literally, because slavery was just words, right? You could write a pass, you could write your history, you could write your story, as Frederick Douglass and so many others did. And the moment you have a visible text, you have evidence, the game changes. And so what we see is this insistence, and it's brutal, so that you could be put to death. You could lose limbs, you could lose fingers, you could be branded, you could be sold. The tyranny of it was horrible. So for every letter learned, every letter, every line, every word, every source, and all the ways in which enslaved people managed to gather knowledge, and that's one of the most impressive things about the Frederick Douglass story, is the way in which he gathered that together. But when you think of somebody like Nat Turner in 1831, right, Nat Turner leads one of the largest slave revolts in America, and he's literate. He's literate. And after that revolt, everybody's, sort of pro-slavery says, that's it. Literacy equals revolt equal freedom. Shut it down completely now, and draconian laws came into effect.
All right, we said we have a lot of people joining us from around the country. We're going to go to a video question from the National Underground Relief Freedom Center. Is it Allie? Are you there?
I'm Allie from Villa Madonna Academy in Villa Hills, Kentucky. Abolitionists from the 1800s and leaders from the civil rights movement developed their own plans for social justice. What are some key similarities and differences in those movements, and how can we as students use these similarities to get involved in the network to fight modern-day slavery?
Ambassador, do you want to dive in?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's important to realize about the civil rights movement, which we loosely think of as something from the 60s, but that's really because it started having its successes in the 60s. In many ways, the civil rights movement in America can date back to all the way back to the abolitionists without any break in it. But when we're talking about the civil rights movement, we're largely talking about things that are under the 14th and 15th Amendments, things like access to education, equality in being able to vote, all of those things, which are really predicated upon the 13th Amendment coming into full force. So it's no surprise that the work of the civil rights movement with Westminster School District case, with Brown versus Board of Education, with the bus boycotts and other things that were happening throughout the 50s, follow on a very important Supreme Court case in 1946, which finally makes it illegal for the Southern sheriffs to basically go out and round up all of the young black men 3 weeks before the harvest, and then let the plantation owners bail them out from their criminal charges. That really is the final nail in the coffin of legal slavery 80 plus years after the Civil War. It's not until the back of the sharecropping system, the back of slavery is broken, that the other civil rights movement can happen. And to me, what that tells us is, in the modern abolitionist standpoint, is that civil rights, and whether we think of them as voting, education, whether we're thinking about new groups, immigration reform, whether it's access to marriage, all these other new things that we're thinking about in the civil rights movements today cannot be divorced from the fight against modern slavery. Because again, if you're not free, then access to education or access to hiring or equal pay is meaningless. So I think that's one of the things that we have to learn. The other thing, of course, is that the networks that were involved, the abolitionist networks, they weren't just spending time talking about slavery, they were also talking about women's rights. It was Frederick Douglass that ends up being the man who stands up at one of the first women's conferences, the Seneca Falls Conference, and says, if you're fighting so hard to get me as a black man the right to vote when you have your abolitionist hat on, then why aren't we fighting together to get you the right to vote as women? And I think it's that notion that we have to work together across all of the different civil rights communities, whether it's the Latino community, African American, any community that needs that help. And we learned that 150 years ago. We just need to do it again today.
It's interesting that, there's no Facebook, there's no Twitter, there's no, I mean, how did these abolitionists connect with each other? Ken or Lois?
Well, they used the communication tools that they had at their disposal at the time. Frederick Douglass gave speeches. He published the North Star newspaper, which was a leading abolitionist voice. They passed out leaflets and pamphlets. And they used the communication tools that they had to communicate the inhumanity of slavery. And one of the things that we do in schools today with secondary schools is go in and talk about the history of slavery and Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and how they went about abolishing slavery, and then transition into this modern day human rights issue, and that slavery still exists and we need modern day abolitionists to do really the same thing that Frederick Douglass did, and to use the communication tools that you have at your disposal. You guys possess in the palm of your hand the greatest communication tool known to man, and the way you're communicating on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and text messaging, through the stroke of a key, you can reach more people than Frederick Douglass probably could have reached his whole publishing career. So the things that you can do are very powerful.
Literature as well, and that's going to bring us to our next video clip, what the professor's going to set up for us.
So the clip that we're about to see features Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's the author, as many of you know, of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the power of Harriet Beecher Stowe's calling as an abolitionist was really prompted by what she saw. And we're going to see a clip in which she, in a sense, comes of age as a young woman living in a nation where slavery is carried out and the enslavement of people is carried out in public view. And we'll see how she responds and reacts.
Over the next 2 years, Garrison gradually won adherents to the anti-slavery cause. Almost 50 abolitionist groups formed in 10 states. Their influence extended from urban centers like Philadelphia and New York to remote settlements like Cincinnati, a boom town on the western frontier. There, Lyman Beecher, one of the country's most famous preachers, had recently moved his family. Beecher opposed slavery in principle, but distrusted activists who recklessly advocated immediate abolition. His 22-year-old daughter, Harriet, had inherited his views. There is a class of professed abolitionists in Cincinnati, she wrote, but they are unfashionable and are regarded as a species of moral monomaniacs.
He wants to be noticed.
Don't tell.
In the spring of 1833, Harriet and two friends crossed over the river into neighboring Kentucky.
You can tell when a man likes to take
She had never before visited a slave state.
Never mind.
We have this fine specimen here. What do you get? 25. 25? 50? We got 50 going once. 50 going twice. 50 sold to the gentleman here. How you gentlemen doing this nice, warm Kentucky day? Gotta keep this thing going.
What Stowe sees there is a human thing. She sees these people, I mean, they're human beings. She's confronted with it in such an intimate way. And I think that never leaves her.
One of the things we should also point out about abolitionists is their lives were in danger as well. They were truly brave. The abolitionists were not welcome in the South and even parts of the North, correct?
Absolutely. One of the myths about that moment of American history where we have abolitionists that people were pro-slavery. Were they pro-slavery in the North? Absolutely. Were they anti-abolitionist? Absolutely. So you have individuals who are putting their lives on the line, many who are even dying. Elijah Lovejoy, editor of a newspaper, his press is thrown into the river and he is killed. Basically, these people doing extraordinary things. William Lloyd Garrison was almost lynched in Boston by a group called Boston Gentlemen. So it has nothing to do with place. It's all about the politics of the moment.
Even here in D.C., the first one who ever tried to set up a school to teach colored girls had it burned down. She had to move the school 4 times before she could even find a location. I think we have a question from the audience. Right over here? Sir, step up.
Hello, my name is Henry Arias. I'm a junior at Phelps Senior High School. My question is, given that Uncle Tom's Cabin was such an influential movement of the national conversation on slavery, what forms of modern communication, such as journalism, social media, films, and literature, should influence the movement of national and international awareness and the conversation about slavery today?
We were talking a little bit earlier about a website called change.org. And this will answer your question a little bit. Ken, tell the audience a little bit about a petition that you helped start on change.org.
Well, as you mentioned, we're in the midst of the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and our organization asked secondary schools from around the country to come together to write a new proclamation of freedom for the victims of today's slavery. So this document was written by students, and the students decided to take that document and turn it into a change.org petition, and the ask in the document is to ask the U.S. Department of Education to help facilitate a national human trafficking prevention and education program, because obviously prevention, education is important so that we can get at the root cause of this problem. So change.org is a very important website.
Ambassador, can you give us a couple of examples? We were talking backstage a little bit about the increased awareness about this issue and some of the legal gains that have been made in the past 7-8 years.
Well, I think that one of the things that we see is that we both have a cultural change that's happening, whether it's through church groups, whether it's through social media, the change.org petitions, the slaveryfootprint.org, which is, I think, one of the sponsors of the materials that were passed out. But at the same time, it does take mass popular media. Harriet Beecher Stowe was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin because she had a point to prove, but it was also a good book, and people wanted to read it. And it reads a little archaic to a modern eye, but back then it was the first time that readers had actually thought of slaves, some of them first time they'd ever thought of an African American, as having the same hopes and dreams that they did. Now you get that kind of thing, it's typically going to be made by Hollywood because they have a profit motive. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people have come to the anti-slavery work in the last few years because of the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, where, he goes and he fights the bad guys to get his daughter back. It's not necessarily the most accurate portrayal of human trafficking, the most accurate portrayal of how modern slavery works. But in some ways that doesn't matter because it brings people in so they can then, whether it's through a Students Against Slavery, whether it's through the work of the folks that are doing work on social media, et cetera, they can learn more about modern slavery by seeing that. And I think that that's what's so important. We have to encourage, whether it's TV shows or Hollywood or whoever, to start bringing it in. It has an effect, I think, because, if you think about, for instance, we're doing a lot of work in my office with Will and Jada Smith. And, one of the reasons why they're so interested in having their family work on this is because Willow came home and had seen some things at school, but then she went and looked it up online and had seen the fact that kids her age, kids y'all's age, around the world, that was happening to them. Now, so they then turned around and Jada Smith makes a music video that talks about the plight of women in Mexico that are going through this. So I think that notion of art activism and then more art is something that actually mimics what we saw with the plays, with the poems, with the newspapers, and with the books of the 1840s and 1850s. In a lot of ways, lightning striking twice if we're only ready to watch it.
From our folks who are watching online, we've got a question from Brianna and Laura. They're at Flowery Branch High School, so hi, Brianna and Laura. How has slavery existed this long? What do you think, Professor or Ambassador? Who wants to dive in?
Well, in part, slavery has existed this long because it's part of the larger human condition. Work needs to be done. People have an inclination to profit from others. We could live in a world that is completely at peace, but we don't. We could live in a world where everybody has a fair shake at education, at housing, at really following their dreams. We don't. We could live in a world where everyone could vote freely. We don't. So in so many ways, slavery is one of those really unfortunate and persistent realities. And it requires courage. It requires time. It requires faith to fight it. And it requires presence of mind. And, we've talked a lot about the courage of abolitionists. And certainly that hasn't changed. In order to make change in the world today, you have to be brave because you are standing up and saying, I've seen something that I would like to talk about, and I've seen something that I would like to protest. And sometimes you get an audience, sometimes you don't. And it's being able to go the distance. But I just wanted to follow up too on the question about literature, because it's so important as we live in this age where everything is going virtual, it seems. It's really important to keep reading books. And some of the greatest and most transformative political tools have been novels, historical fiction. And so if you have a moment, look for a book called Someone Knows My Name. It's by a fellow named Lawrence Hill, and it is one of the most stunning and sobering stories of a young girl who comes through that Middle Passage and comes of age in America and then Nova Scotia and then England. But it's the stories, it's Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's the narratives, it's the novels. And we have to find the passion to tell the history in our own way, and that's how slavery will end. Everybody coming to it with an agenda that is true to them.
Something you said that really hit my ear, and I remember I was in South Carolina a couple months ago, and I went to the slave mart, one of the slave marts where they have the real stories and people in their own voice. In the 40s, some people went around and recorded last slaves who were in their 80s and 90s telling their stories, and a lot of it just came down to money.
Yes.
It came down to commerce. South Carolina was so rich, and it helped fund the Revolutionary War. It was about their way of life and money and making money, bottom line. Ambassador, in this day and time, who's making the money off of modern-day slavery?
Well, I think that the money's being made by a number of folks. It's a huge industry. The UN and others that have researched this are showing it at about a $30+ billion a year industry, just in profits to the traffickers, another $20 billion in losses to the victims. And it can, because it's diffuse, it's a lot of different people. It's the rice mill owner in India that has an entire family working for them because that person's grandfather borrowed $20 in 1930.
Wow.
And has never been able, the family's never been able to pay that off. But that rice mill owner and all of the people in their social class that are doing that get the benefit. It's the corrupt government official who owns the palm oil plantations out in the rural parts of Southeast Asia and knows that the men that are working on those plantations aren't free to leave, that they'll be hunted down, that they'll be killed if they try to leave, but then also knows that they're bringing in women to serve those men in prostitution, enslaved girls. So it's, I think it's something that we've seen, that there's kind of the big systemic things, whether it's seafood, whether it's palm oil, whether it's cotton in Central Asia, or bricks and rice in India. But then there's also the little things. The cases that we've done around here in D.C., it's been a pimp that has a 15-year-old girl in a hotel out on Benning Road. It's a diplomat from another country who has a servant in their apartment in Falls Church or in Silver Spring. They're not making a lot of money, but they're getting something out of that. They get the free work, but also that notion of cruelty and the fact that the cruel masters. When you look at what Frederick Douglass talks about with the woman that was his master when he got sent to Baltimore as a house slave, and how at first she was nice to him because she didn't know any better. By the time she was done, she was beating on him all the time. It's because something happens not just to the slave, but to the master. And we see that now, that some of this is economic, and some of it is then that extra little level of cruelty on the part of the masters. And the two can't really be sussed out. And I don't think they necessarily were sussed out back then either. We think of it as this is an economic structure, but there were people that lived, that loved, that had different relationships, that had cruelty, kindness, all of that wrapped up in this, because at the end of the day, slavery is about people.
So you're all probably thinking, like, what can I do? This is so big, this is systemic, this is long-term. And that's actually why we have Anna here, because Anna's 17, and she decided she wanted to do something. Because one of the big questions is, what can I do? Anna, tell a little bit what you did to make a difference.
Okay. I want to start with the education part. Just like Frederick Douglass, and then going to the Civil Rights Movement, Frederick Douglass teaching himself how to read, and then articulating that, and with Dr. King, he was just so educated that he was able to get the word out. I think what we need to do, what my group, Student Abolitionists Stopping Slavery, does, is we put the word out. We are about awareness. And I feel like not only are you giving a voice to those who don't have one, but you are giving, the more people that are aware, the more people that are willing to make a change. And I feel like that's where it starts. When you start educating and like putting this in people's minds, it's hard to get back from it. Like the fact that you're all here right now learning about this is where it starts. And I was at events like this year, last year, and just like gaining knowledge, information. It sounds so cliche, but knowledge is power. And that's where it starts, I think. And then after that, SAS does a lot of fundraising. And
Tell me what SAS stands for before.
Student Abolitionists Stopping Slavery. And so fundraising is huge because as high schoolers we feel a little bit like we can't do much, and I mean I can't go in and actually physically rescue a kid from home or you know, go to India and like do research. But with the money that you do raise and go to nonprofit organizations such as Free the Slaves, which is what SAS does, you can feel like you did that part because you're giving money to those people who can go out and do the physical work and save people. And then simple things like writing a petition to your state legislator. Connecticut didn't have a law against human trafficking, and until back in like 2004 when SAS started, they wrote a petition to the Connecticut state legislator and to get that law passed. So small things like that, writing a letter, even to companies. We wrote, like Valentine's Day, for example, is coming up, a letter to Hershey's like a couple of years ago. They didn't have fair trade chocolate, and so we wrote like letters like have a heart, and like made it pretty and said, hey, do you want to like try and get fair trade to be a part of what you do? And Hershey's has probably, we were probably the only ones, but just that small push probably helped them to become a fair trade sort of thing, you know? And something that you might think is insignificant is not, because I mean, I'm here just for the little bit of work that I've done with my group. So, I mean, any one of you could be up here just for a little work that you do.
And I think that's actually a great way to end. Any one of you could do something big with a little bit of work today. Everybody, let's thank our panel. And once again, thanks to the Smithsonian for putting together this fantastic project.